Elena Volkov stood in the grand lobby of the Metropolitan Concert Hall, her expensive heels making sharp clicking sounds against the shiny marble floor. She was scrolling through her phone, barely paying attention to the crowd of people surrounding her. At just 26 years old, she had already become one of the most talked-about pianists in the world. Her concert sold out within hours. Her latest album had just hit platinum status. Tonight's performance had been another massive success, and she knew it. The people around her couldn't stop talking about how amazing she was. They kept asking for photos, begging for autographs, telling her she was the best pianist they'd ever heard. Elena smiled and nodded, but deep down, she had heard it all before. She was used to being the center of attention. She expected it. Among the crowd was a young businessman named David who had been trying to get her attention for months. He was rich, successful, and confident. He kept bringing her expensive gifts and showing up at all her concerts. Tonight was no different. "That was incredible, Elena," David said, moving closer to her. "You make it look so easy up there." Elena laughed softly, flipping her dark hair over her shoulder. "Years of practice, darling. Though I suppose some of us are just born with it." As they talked, Elena's eyes wandered around the lobby. In the corner, near a service corridor, she noticed an old upright piano. It looked beaten up and out of place in such a fancy building. The wood was scratched, and the finish had dulled over the years. It was the kind of piano they kept around for staff members or students to practice on. Nothing special. "Oh my God," Elena said, pointing at the piano with a mocking smile. "They still have that dinosaur here? I'm surprised it even stays in tune." David followed her gaze and chuckled. "Why don't you play something on it? Give us a private concert." The suggestion made several people in the crowd excited. They started encouraging her, clapping their hands together. But Elena just shook her head and waved them off. "On that?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Absolutely not. I only play on instruments that cost more than most people make in a year. That thing probably sounds like a toy compared to what I'm used to." The crowd laughed along with her, though some people looked a bit uncomfortable, but Elena didn't notice or care. She was on a roll now, enjoying the attention and the power she felt in the moment. Then something sparked in her mind, a wicked idea that made her smile grow wider. She turned to face everyone, raising her voice so the whole crowd could hear her clearly. "You know what? I'll make you all a deal," she announced dramatically. "If anyone here can sit down at that pathetic little piano and play Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, first movement, without any sheet music, I will marry them right here, right now. Tonight." The lobby erupted with laughter and excited chatter. Everyone knew what she was asking for. Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto was legendary among musicians. It was one of the most difficult pieces ever written. Piano students feared it. Professional pianists spent years mastering it. The technical demands were insane, with passages that required your fingers to move faster than seemed humanly possible. And she wanted someone to play it from memory, without any music in front of them. It was impossible. That was the joke. David stepped up first, never one to back down from a challenge. "All right, I'll give it a shot," he said confidently, though several people could tell he was already regretting it. He walked over to the old piano and sat down. He cracked his knuckles like he was preparing for something serious. Then he placed his fingers on the keys and started to play. The first few notes came out okay, but then everything fell apart. His fingers stumbled. The rhythm was wrong. The melody got lost somewhere in the middle. After about 30 seconds of painful noise, he stopped and stood up, laughing awkwardly. Okay, I tried," he said, holding up his hands in defeat. "Elena, you're safe. I'm not your future husband," everyone laughed. A few other people joked about trying, but nobody actually moved toward the piano. They knew better. These were wealthy business people and art collectors, not concert pianists. Some of them couldn't even read music. Elena was loving every second of it. She felt powerful, untouchable. In her mind, this was just more proof that she was special, that she was better than everyone else. Not because she was mean or cruel by nature, but because success had slowly changed her over the years. When everyone constantly tells you you're amazing, when doors open everywhere you go, when money and fame come easily, it's hard not to start believing you're somehow superior to regular people. She had forgotten what it felt like to struggle. She had forgotten that music was supposed to be about beauty and emotion, not about showing off or putting others down. Somewhere along the way, her gift had turned into a weapon she used to feel better than everyone around her. The crowd was starting to break up, people heading toward the exits or the coat check. The joke had run its course. Elena was checking her phone again, probably looking at social media posts about tonight's concert, when she heard a quiet voice behind her. "Excuse me, miss." She turned around, not really paying attention. Standing there was an older man wearing a janitor's uniform. He looked to be in his early 60s with gray hair and tired eyes. His uniform was clean but worn, and he had the kind of weathered hands that came from years of hard physical work. He was holding a mop, having been cleaning the floors in a corner of the lobby during all the commotion. Elena barely glanced at him. "Yes, do you need us to clear the area or something?" The old janitor shook his head slightly. When he spoke, his voice was soft and carried a thick accent that suggested he wasn't originally from America. "No, miss. I would like to accept your challenge." For a moment, nobody reacted. The words hung in the air like they didn't quite make sense. Then slowly, people started to understand what he had just said. The old janitor wanted to try playing Rachmaninoff. The cleaning man with the mop wanted to take Elena's challenge. The laughter started almost immediately. It rippled through the crowd like a wave. People looked at each other in disbelief, smiling and shaking their heads. David actually laughed out loud, stepping toward the old man. "Come on, old-timer," David said, not meanly but definitely condescending. "Do you even know who Rachmaninoff is? This isn't some simple song. It's one of the hardest pieces of music ever written." But the janitor didn't respond to David. He didn't argue or explain himself. He simply set down his mop carefully, leaning it against the wall. Then he walked slowly toward the old upright piano in the corner. His movements were quiet and deliberate, like he was approaching something sacred. The crowd watched, still amused, as he reached the piano bench. He pulled it out slightly, adjusting it to the right height. Then he rolled up the sleeves of his uniform, revealing forearms that still had some muscle despite his age. He sat down on the bench, his posture straightening. For just a moment, he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Then he placed his hands on the keys, and everything changed. Viktor Sokolov had been working as a janitor at the Metropolitan Concert Hall for exactly 3 years and 4 months. Every evening, he followed the same routine. He would start in the upper balconies, work his way down through the main seating area, then finish in the lobby and backstage corridors. He emptied trash cans, mopped floors, cleaned bathrooms, and made sure everything was spotless for the next day's events. Most people didn't even notice him. To the wealthy concert-goers in their expensive clothes, he was basically invisible. Just another old man in a uniform doing a job that nobody wanted to think about. And honestly, Viktor preferred it that way. Being invisible meant being safe. It meant the past couldn't find him. But there was one part of his job that Viktor actually looked forward to. After everyone left, when the building was quiet and empty, he would sometimes linger near the practice rooms. He would stand in the hallway and listen to the faint echoes of music that seemed to stay in the walls even after the musicians had gone home. Sometimes he could still hear phantom melodies floating through the empty spaces, like ghosts of beautiful performances. On rare occasions, when he was absolutely certain he was alone, Viktor would do something he wasn't supposed to do. He would walk into one of the small practice rooms, sit down at the piano and play. Just for a few minutes. Just enough to remember what it felt like. His fingers would find the keys in the darkness, and for those brief moments he wasn't a 62-year-old janitor anymore. He was someone else. Someone he used to be a very long time ago. Tonight had started like any other night. He had watched the well-dressed crowd filtering out after Elena Volkov's concert. He had heard them talking about how brilliant she was, how perfect her technique was. Viktor had listened to part of her performance from the hallway, and he had to admit she was talented. Very talented, but there was something missing in her playing, something important that all the technical skill in the world couldn't replace. He was emptying a trash bin near the lobby when he heard her voice rise above the crowd. That's when he heard the challenge. The arrogant offer, the way she laughed and mocked the old piano in the corner, the way she turned one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever written into a joke, a game to prove how much better she was than everyone else. Something twisted in Viktor's chest. It wasn't quite anger. It was more like a deep sadness mixed with a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. It felt almost like disappointment, but not in Elena, in himself, because Viktor knew something that nobody else in that lobby knew. He knew Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto. He knew it better than he knew his own face in the mirror. He had played it hundreds of times in his old life, in concert halls across Europe and Russia. He had recorded it. Critics had called his interpretation definitive, legendary even, but that was another lifetime ago. That was before everything fell apart. Victor had been born in Moscow in 1963. His mother was a music teacher, and she had noticed something special in him before he could even walk properly. By the time he was 4, he was playing simple melodies. By 7, he was performing in local competitions. By 12, he was being called a prodigy, a genius, the next great Russian pianist. His teenage years were a blur of practice rooms, competitions, and performances. He won every major competition in Russia. By 16, he was playing with the Moscow Philharmonic Orchestra. By 20, he was touring internationally. Critics ran out of praise words to describe his playing. His recordings sold millions of copies. He was compared to the greatest pianists in history. At 23, he met Natasha. She was a violinist, beautiful and kind, with a laugh that could light up a room. They fell in love fast and hard the way young artists do. They got married within a year. 2 years later, their daughter Anya was born. She had her mother's eyes and her father's love for music. Those were the happiest years of Victor's life. He had everything: fame, family, the ability to make music that moved people to tears. He thought it would last forever. Then came December 19, 1994, a snowy night in Moscow. Victor was supposed to perform that evening, but Natasha and 8-year-old Anya had wanted to go to Natasha's parents' house for dinner first. Victor stayed behind to practice. He told them he'd meet them later after his rehearsal. They never made it to her parents' house. A drunk driver ran a red light at full speed. The car was hit so hard that it spun 3 times before crashing into a wall. Natasha died instantly. Anya held on for 6 hours at the hospital, but her injuries were too severe. Victor held his daughter's small hand as she took her last breath. She was 8 years old. After that, Victor stopped being able to play. He would sit at the piano and his hands would shake. Every note reminded him of them. Every melody brought back memories that were too painful to bear. Music had been his whole life, but now it only brought agony. He canceled his tour. He stopped answering phone calls from his agent, from concert halls, from friends. He stopped leaving his apartment. Months passed in a fog of grief. People tried to help, but he pushed everyone away. 1 year after the accident, Victor disappeared. He left Russia with nothing but a single suitcase. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He just vanished. The newspapers ran stories about the brilliant pianist who had lost his mind, who had abandoned his career, who might have killed himself. Eventually, people stopped looking for him. Victor ended up in America. He worked odd jobs, construction work, dishwashing, whatever he could find that didn't require much English or many questions. He learned the language slowly. He moved from city to city, never staying anywhere too long. He avoided anything related to music. If he walked past a concert hall or heard classical music playing in a store, he would leave immediately. It hurt too much. Eventually, he settled down and found some measure of peace in the routine of simple work. Being a janitor at the Metropolitan Concert Hall was risky, being so close to music again, but by that point, enough time had passed. He was older, invisible. Nobody recognized him. Nobody looked at janitors long enough to see their faces anyway. For 3 years, he had maintained his invisible life successfully. He had kept his past buried. He had convinced himself that the man he used to be was dead, and that was okay. He had made peace with it. But tonight, hearing Elena's cruel challenge, something cracked open inside him. All those years of silence, all that buried pain and beauty, all the music he had locked away, it all came rushing back at once. His hands were shaking as he walked toward the piano. He could hear people laughing, could sense their amusement at the idea of an old janitor thinking he could play Rachmaninoff. He didn't care. This wasn't about proving them wrong. This wasn't even really about Elena, though she needed to learn something tonight. This was about the music itself. About honoring something sacred that she had treated like a toy. About reminding himself, after 30 years of silence, why he had fallen in love with the piano in the first place. Victor sat down at the bench and adjusted it carefully. He rolled up his sleeves. His heart was pounding in his chest so hard he thought it might burst. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. In his mind, he saw Natasha smiling at him from the audience. He saw little Anya clapping her hands with joy. He felt their love surrounding him like a warm blanket. Then Victor placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The first notes that came from the old piano were soft, almost hesitant. Victor's fingers touched the keys like he was greeting an old friend he hadn't seen in decades. The sound was gentle, careful, as if the piano itself was waking up from a long sleep. For a moment, the crowd's laughter continued. A few people were still whispering to each other, smiling at what they thought was going to be an embarrassing disaster. But then something changed. The gentle notes suddenly exploded into a cascade of sound. Victor's fingers began flying across the keyboard with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his age. The technical passages that made professional pianists nervous poured out of him effortlessly, like water from a broken dam. His hands moved so fast they almost blurred, jumping from one end of the keyboard to the other with perfect precision. But it wasn't just the technical skill that made people stop laughing. It was something else, something much deeper. Every note carried weight. Every phrase told a story. When Victor played the tender sections, you could hear love in the music. When he played the dramatic parts, you could feel pain and loss. When the melody soared upward, it felt like hope breaking through darkness. The laughter died in seconds. People who had been walking toward the exit stopped mid-step and turned around. The conversations cut off like someone had pressed a mute button on the entire room. Everyone just stood there frozen, listening. David's mouth hung open. He had been smiling just moments ago, ready to enjoy watching the old janitor fail. Now he looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. His face had gone pale. Elena felt her breath catch in her throat. She had heard thousands of pianists in her life. She had studied at the best music schools in the world. She had listened to legendary recordings by the masters. But what she was hearing right now was different. This wasn't just someone playing the notes correctly. This was someone who had lived an entire lifetime and was pouring every moment of it into the music. More people started gathering from other parts of the building. Security guards stopped their rounds. Staff members peeked out from behind doors. A cleaning woman stood in a doorway with tears streaming down her face, not even bothering to wipe them away. Victor's eyes were closed. He wasn't reading music. He wasn't even looking at the keys. He was somewhere else entirely, lost in a world that only he could see. His body swayed slightly with the rhythm. His face showed everything he was feeling, every emotion flowing through him like electricity. There was a passage in the middle of the piece that was famously difficult, a section where both hands had to play incredibly fast notes at the same time, while also making it sound musical rather than mechanical. Most pianists struggled with it even after years of practice. Victor played it like he was breathing. His fingers found every note perfectly, and somehow, impossibly, he made it sound easy and beautiful at the same time. Elena's hands were shaking. She pressed them against her chest, trying to steady herself. She felt something breaking inside her, something that had been building up for years. Tears started forming in her eyes, and she didn't understand why. She wasn't sad. She wasn't happy either. It was something else, something she couldn't name. The music built toward the climax, the moment where the piano had to sound like an entire orchestra. Victor's hands crashed down on the keys with tremendous power. But even in the loudest moments, every note was clear and intentional. Nothing was sloppy or rushed. It was controlled chaos, beautiful violence, structured passion. Then, just as suddenly as the storm had arrived, it softened again. The final section of the movement was gentler, almost like a lullaby. Victor played it with such tenderness that several people in the crowd started openly crying. It felt like he was saying goodbye to something precious, something lost forever. When Victor played the final chord, he held it, letting it ring out and slowly fade into silence. His hand stayed on the keys for a long moment afterward. Nobody moved. Nobody made a sound. The silence felt sacred, like being in a church. Then Victor lifted his hands from the keyboard and slowly opened his eyes. He looked down at his own hands like he didn't quite recognize them, like he couldn't believe what they had just done. The silence lasted another few seconds, then the lobby erupted. The applause was thunderous, almost violent in its intensity. People weren't just clapping politely. They were cheering, shouting, some of them literally jumping up and down. Several people had tears running down their faces. Others stood there with their hands over their mouths, looking stunned. David was clapping so hard his palms had to be hurting. The security guards were applauding. The other staff members were applauding. Even some people walking past the building outside had stopped and were peering through the glass doors, trying to figure out what was happening. Victor stood up slowly from the piano bench. His legs felt shaky like he'd just run a marathon. His hands were trembling. He looked at the crowd with quiet, tired eyes that held decades of pain and memory. Elena couldn't move. She stood frozen in place, mascara running down her cheeks from her tears. Her earlier confidence, her arrogance, all of it had shattered like glass. She felt naked, exposed, like someone had held up a mirror and forced her to see who she really was. "Who are you?" she finally managed to whisper, though her voice was so quiet that barely anyone heard her over the applause. But someone else had heard something in Victor's playing. An elderly woman pushed through the crowd, her expensive jewelry glinting under the lobby lights. Her name was Patricia, and she was one of the concert hall's biggest donors. She had been attending classical music performances for over 50 years. Her face had gone completely white. "Oh my God," Patricia said, her voice shaking. She stared at Victor like she was seeing a ghost. Victor Sokolov?" The name hung in the air. A few of the older people in the crowd gasped. Some of the younger people looked confused, but they could tell from everyone's reactions that the name meant something important. "That's impossible," someone said. "Victor Sokolov disappeared 30 years ago. Everyone thought he was dead." Patricia was already pulling out her phone with trembling fingers. She typed the name into a search engine, and within seconds images appeared on her screen. Black and white photographs of a young, handsome man sitting at a grand piano. Newspaper headlines in multiple languages. Album covers with his name in bold letters. She held up her phone, comparing the old photographs to the man standing in front of them in a janitor's uniform. The face was older, weathered by time and hardship, but the eyes were the same. It was him. "The Mozart of Moscow," Patricia breathed. "You were called the greatest pianist of your generation. You performed for presidents and prime ministers. Your recording of this exact piece won every major award. Then you just vanished after that horrible accident with your family. Everyone thought you had died, maybe killed yourself from grief. But you've been here? Working as a janitor?" The crowd erupted again, but this time with shocked whispers and frantic phone activity. Everyone was searching his name, pulling up articles and old videos. The lobby filled with the sound of people gasping and exclaiming as they discovered who Victor really was. Victor stood silently in the center of it all, looking overwhelmed and small, despite what he had just done. This was exactly what he had been hiding from for 3 decades. The recognition, the attention, the questions he didn't want to answer. He turned slowly to face Elena, who still stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. "I believe you made a promise, miss," Victor said quietly, his accented voice barely audible above the chaos around them. Elena couldn't breathe properly. Her chest felt tight like someone was squeezing her heart. She looked at Victor standing there in his janitor's uniform, this man who had just played one of the most beautiful performances she had ever heard in her life, and she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Shame. Deep, crushing shame. She started, but her voice broke. She swallowed hard and tried again. "I don't know what to say." The crowd around them had their phones out now. Some people were recording video, others were taking pictures. A few were already posting on social media, and Elena could imagine the headlines that would appear within hours. Famous pianist humiliated by janitor, arrogant concert star gets taught a lesson. She could see her reputation crumbling in real time. But somehow that wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt was the look in Victor's eyes. He wasn't angry. He wasn't gloating or enjoying her embarrassment. He just looked tired and sad, like someone who had seen too much of life's cruelty and was disappointed to see more of it. "You have great talent, Miss Volkov," Victor said quietly, his accent making the words sound both gentle and heavy. "I listened to your concert tonight from the hallway. Your technique is perfect. Your fingers are fast and accurate. You hit every note exactly right." Elena felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe he was going to compliment her, tell her she was good despite what had just happened. But then he continued, and his words cut deeper than any criticism she'd ever received. "But you play like someone who has never suffered," Victor said, "like someone who has never lost anything. You play the notes, but you do not play the music. Do you understand the difference?" Elena opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She wanted to defend herself, to argue, but she couldn't, because he was right. She knew he was right. "Tonight you treated music like a weapon, Victor continued, his voice still soft but firm. You used it to make yourself feel superior to others. You mocked this piano, mocked the idea that anyone else could play what you play. You turned something beautiful into a game of pride. Tears were flowing freely down Elena's face now. Her expensive makeup was completely ruined, but she didn't care. Some people in the crowd looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot. Others watched with fascination like they were witnessing something important. David tried to step forward, maybe to defend Elena or change the subject, but Patricia held up her hand to stop him. Let him speak, she said firmly. Victor took a step closer to Elena. He wasn't trying to intimidate her. He just wanted her to hear him clearly, to understand. Music is not about showing people what they cannot do, he said. It is not about being better than others. Music is about sharing something that words cannot say. It is about connecting human hearts across all the things that separate us. When you play only to prove your superiority, you kill the very thing that makes music matter. Elena's legs felt weak. She thought she might actually collapse right there in the lobby. Everything Victor was saying resonated with a truth she had been avoiding for years. When had she become this person? When had she stopped playing because she loved music and started playing because she loved the applause? I'm so sorry, Elena whispered, her voice cracking. You're right. About all of it. I was cruel and arrogant, and I don't deserve... She looked at Victor with red, swollen eyes. You don't have to marry me, obviously. That was a stupid, awful thing to say. I was showing off and being horrible. Victor's expression softened slightly. No, he agreed. I do not want to marry you. I am an old man, and that was never the point of accepting your challenge. Then why did you play? Elena asked, genuinely confused. Why expose yourself like this? You've been hiding for 30 years. Now everyone knows who you are. Your face is probably already all over the internet. Your life here, your privacy, it's all gone now because of what I said. Victor was quiet for a moment, looking down at his weathered hands. When he spoke again, his voice was even softer, almost like he was talking to himself. For 30 years, I ran from music because it hurt too much. Every note reminded me of what I lost. My wife, my daughter, my whole life, it all died in one night. I thought if I never played again, maybe the pain would go away. But pain does not work that way. You cannot run from it. It follows you everywhere. He looked back up at Elena, and she saw something in his eyes that made her heart ache. It was grief, yes, but also something else. Something like acceptance. Tonight, when I heard you mock the piano and turn Rachmaninoff into a joke, something woke up inside me, Victor said. I realized that by hiding from music, I was not honoring my family's memory. I was making their deaths mean nothing. They loved music. My wife, my little daughter, they loved when I played. Running away from the piano was like running away from them. Several people in the crowd were crying now. Not just Elena. Patricia had her hand pressed against her mouth, tears streaming down her elegant face. Even some of the security guards had misty eyes. So I played, Victor continued. Not to embarrass you, though maybe you needed to feel embarrassed. I played because it was time to stop hiding. Time to stop pretending I am not a musician. That part of me never died, no matter how hard I tried to kill it. The lobby had gone completely silent except for Victor's voice. Even the people who had been busy on their phones had stopped and were listening. But you, Victor said, turning his full attention back to Elena. You need to learn something before it is too late. Before success makes you into someone you do not recognize. You are young. You still have time to change. To remember why you started playing piano in the first place. Was it for the applause? For the fame? Or was it because music made you feel something beautiful? Elena thought back to when she was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old. She remembered sitting at her grandmother's old piano, pressing the keys and being amazed by the sounds they made. She remembered playing simple songs and feeling pure joy. Not because anyone was watching or praising her, but just because the music itself was magical. When had she lost that? When had the joy been replaced by ambition and ambition replaced by arrogance? I don't know how to be that person anymore, Elena admitted, her voice small and broken. The person who plays for the right reasons. I've spent so long trying to be the best, trying to be better than everyone else, I forgot how to just love music. Victor nodded slowly, like he understood exactly what she meant. Then you must learn again, he said simply. Like a child learning to walk. You must start over, but this time build on a better foundation. Will you teach me? The words came out of Elena's mouth before she even realized she was going to say them. But once they were out, she knew it was exactly what she needed. Not piano technique. I know technique. Teach me what you know about music. About playing with heart instead of ego, please. I'll do whatever it takes. Victor studied her for a long moment. The crowd waited breathlessly to hear what he would say. Elena held her breath, realizing that his answer mattered more to her than any concert review or award ever had. Finally, Victor spoke. Perhaps we can learn together, he said quietly. I ran from music for too long. You forgot why music matters. Maybe it is time for both of us to remember. The video appeared online within 2 hours. Someone in the crowd had recorded the entire thing. From Elena's arrogant challenge to Victor's breathtaking performance, to the emotional confrontation afterward. By morning, it had been viewed over 2 million times. By the end of the week, that number had jumped to over 50 million. The story exploded everywhere. News channels ran segments about it. Music magazines wrote long articles analyzing Victor's lost career and sudden reappearance. Social media was flooded with opinions. Some people praised Victor as a hero, who had humbled an arrogant young star. Others felt sorry for Elena, saying she had been publicly shamed too harshly. But everyone agreed on one thing. The performance itself had been extraordinary. For Victor, the attention was overwhelming in a way he hadn't prepared for. His quiet, invisible life had been shattered completely. Reporters showed up at the concert hall trying to interview him. His phone, which he barely knew how to use, suddenly filled with messages from people he hadn't spoken to in 3 decades. Concert promoters called offering huge amounts of money for him to perform. Record labels wanted to sign him. Everyone wanted a piece of the legendary pianist who had returned from the dead. He stopped going to work at the concert hall, not because he was fired, but because he couldn't get anything done with all the cameras and people constantly surrounding him. He stayed in his small apartment feeling trapped and anxious. This was exactly what he had been running from for 30 years. Elena's experience was different but equally difficult. The video made her look terrible, and she knew it. The comments online were brutal. People called her spoiled, mean, arrogant, fake. Some called her a talentless fraud who had been exposed by a real musician. Her management team was in panic mode, trying to figure out how to handle the public relations disaster. But something strange was happening to Elena. Instead of feeling defensive or angry about the criticism, she felt relieved. It was like a mask had been ripped off, and even though it hurt, she could finally breathe properly. All those years of pretending to be perfect, of maintaining an image, of never showing weakness, it had been exhausting. Now everyone could see that she wasn't perfect, and somehow that felt freeing. She canceled her upcoming concerts. Her manager nearly had a heart attack when she told him. But Elena was firm. I need time, she said simply. I need to figure out who I am without the stage. 3 days after the incident, Elena showed up at Victor's apartment. She had to push through a small group of reporters outside his building. Ignoring their shouted questions, she knocked on his door nervously, half expecting him to refuse to see her. Victor opened the door looking tired and older than he had at the concert hall. He was wearing a simple sweater and old jeans. His apartment was small and sparse with hardly any furniture. But there in the corner of the living room sat an old upright piano. Not fancy, but well-maintained. I meant what I said, Elena told him, standing in his doorway. About wanting to learn, if the offer still stands. Victor looked at her for a long moment, then stepped aside to let her in. Come, he said quietly. Sit down. They sat at his tiny kitchen table drinking tea. Victor didn't have much to offer, but he made tea the way he had learned in Russia, strong and hot. They didn't talk about the video or the media circus outside. Instead, Victor asked Elena about her childhood, about when she first started playing piano, about what music had meant to her before fame entered the picture. Elena found herself telling stories she hadn't thought about in years. Her grandmother who had taught her first songs. The feeling of discovering that she could make beautiful sounds with her fingers. The pride on her father's face the first time she performed in a school recital. Somewhere along the way, her voice started shaking and tears came again. But these were different tears. Cleaner somehow. You have not lost that girl, Victor said gently. She is still inside you. We just need to remind her that it is safe to come out again. And so began the strangest and most important months of Elena's life. Victor agreed to work with her, but not in the way she expected. He didn't teach her new techniques or harder pieces. Instead, he did something much more challenging. He made her unlearn almost everything she thought she knew about performing. Play something simple, he told her on their first real lesson, something from when you were a child. Elena sat at his old piano and played a simple folk melody, the kind of thing a beginner might learn. But she played it the way she played everything, technically perfect but somehow empty. Again, Victor said, but this time close your eyes. Do not think about your fingers. Think about the person who taught you this song. Remember how you felt when you first learned it. It took her 20 tries before something shifted. Suddenly, the simple melody sounded different. It had warmth. It had memory. It had feeling. When she finished, she opened her eyes and found Victor smiling, really smiling for the first time since she'd met him. There, he said softly, that is music. They worked together 3 or 4 times a week. Victor refused to accept any payment, which frustrated Elena until she realized that money would have ruined what they were building. This wasn't a business transaction. It was something else, something more important. Word got out about their lessons, of course. The media called it the Redemption Tour, or Beauty and the Janitor, or other silly names. But Victor and Elena ignored it all. They focused on the work. Victor started teaching at a community music school in a poor part of the city. The school could barely afford to pay him, but that didn't matter. He worked with kids who couldn't afford private lessons, children from families who would never be able to send them to fancy music academies. Some of these kids had real talent. All of them had genuine love for music, untainted by ego or ambition. Elena started volunteering there too. At first, she felt awkward and out of place. These kids didn't care that she was famous. Half of them didn't even know who she was. But slowly she found her place. She discovered that teaching an 8-year-old how to play their first scale brought her more joy than performing for thousands of people ever had. 6 months after the incident at the concert hall, Victor gave a concert, just one. It was a benefit performance to raise money for families affected by traffic accidents, a cause close to his heart for obvious reasons. The concert sold out in minutes. People flew in from around the world to attend. Elena performed with him that night, but not as the star. She played a supporting role, accompanying Victor on a few pieces. And for the first time in her career, she wasn't thinking about how she looked or sounded. She was just playing, sharing music with someone she had come to love and respect deeply. The concert raised over $3 million, but more importantly, it showed the world something beautiful. It showed that people could change, that pride could be transformed into humility, that it was never too late to remember what really mattered. Victor never went back to regular performing. He had made his point, had done what he needed to do. He continued teaching at the community school, working with kids who reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. Elena's career changed completely. She still performed occasionally, but she was selective about it. She turned down the biggest, flashiest opportunities in favor of smaller, more meaningful events. She gave free concerts at schools and community centers. She started a foundation to provide music lessons to children who couldn't afford them. People noticed the change in her playing. Critics wrote that she had matured as an artist, that her performances now had depth they had lacked before. But Elena didn't pay much attention to reviews anymore. She knew the truth. She had finally learned to play from the heart instead of the ego. 2 years after that night in the concert hall lobby, Elena performed Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3 at a major venue. Victor sat in the audience wearing his old janitor uniform. He had kept it as a reminder of where he had been and what he had learned during his years of hiding. As Elena played the final movement, their eyes met across the concert hall. No words were needed. The music said everything. It spoke of loss and redemption, of pride and humility, of 2 broken people who had helped each other remember what it meant to be whole. When the last note faded and the applause began, Victor stood and clapped along with everyone else. But he wasn't clapping for technical perfection or flawless execution. He was clapping because he could hear it. Finally, after all this time, Elena had learned to play the music instead of just the notes. And that, Victor knew, was worth more than any marriage proposal or award or standing ovation could ever be. That was the real victory. Not proving who was better, but remembering together why music mattered in the first place. The old upright piano from the concert hall lobby was eventually donated to the community school, where Victor and Elena taught. A small plaque was attached to it with words that Victor had spoken that night, words that had changed both their lives. Music is not about showing people what they cannot do. It is about sharing something that words cannot say. Students at the school played that piano every day. Some of them knew the story behind it. Others just knew it as the old piano in the corner. But all of them, whether they realized it or not, were learning the same lesson Victor had taught Elena. That music, real music, comes from the heart, and that the most important performance is not the one that gets the loudest applause, but the one that connects human souls across all the things that separate us. That was Victor's true legacy, not the recordings, or the awards, or the legendary performances of his youth. His legacy was the reminder that music at its best is an act of love. And love, unlike pride, never needs to prove itself to anyone.